We are back, and we are joined now by Daniel Galvin, professor of political science at Northwestern University, author of Alt Labor and the New Politics of Workers' Rights. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, your book centers around how non-unionized workforces form organizations that can kind of better help them stand up to their employers, demand better conditions, better wages and rights. Alt labor groups, as your title indicates. How would you describe these organizations to our audiences and like the conditions basically that they form in if they're, say, unable to be a part of a union?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the first way to think about this, or the best starting place, is to think about the conditions of low-wage work in the United States. As some of your viewers may know, we have persistent problems in the workplace. There's rampant exploitation of low-wage workers, disproportionate number of whom are, people of color, non-citizens, women. They suffer wage theft, discrimination, sexual harassment and abuse, unsafe and unhealthy working conditions. And so these are real life problems for a lot of people, millions and millions of people in the United States. And at the same time, what we've seen is a gradual but steady decline of organized labor and the ability of these types of workers to organize into unions and to avail themselves of the protections that American workers are promised by national laws like the Wagner Act, the National Labor Relations Act that guarantees the right to collective bargaining. Although a lot of these workers are technically legally able to unionize, they find that in a lot of industries they work in, it's extremely difficult to do so. And then you have a whole swath of workers, farm workers, domestic workers, gig workers, right, who actually do not have the right to unionize. It's in that context where you have these workers who are exploited and seek redress for their grievances, that they've come together in these nonprofit organizations, non-union nonprofit organizations, to try to fight for their rights and contest their exploitation and do something to redress the extreme imbalance of power in the workplace and in society.
Farm workers and undocumented people, can you expand a bit on the situations that they find themselves in? Because we've spoken about this within the context of immigration on the show, how the threat of deportation is often used as a point of leverage from employers to employee for people that don't have documentation. Are those many of the people that you analyze in your book, people who basically have very little leverage against their employer because of their status?
So that does account for a significant number of the workers I'm talking about, but it's not like the majority. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you do have a situation in this country where immigration policy and labor policy are not well aligned, right? And so you have the ability for employers who are trying to extract more value out of their workers to leverage threats, and it goes beyond the threat of termination, right? In this case, with the undocumented workers you're talking about, it's very common that they threaten that they would report them to the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which really cuts to the heart of what workers are doing here. In many cases, they're here to be with their families, right? And when their employer threatens to send them back, across the border, wherever it may be, they exert enormous leverage, right, over those workers. Yeah, that's a big part of the power asymmetry that we see in the workplace, and it goes beyond just termination. Yeah.
Right. And so the statistics bear out, obviously, that unions are substantially, if you're a member of a union, you're substantially less likely to have your wages stolen, or to have extreme unsafe conditions as well. But some of the groups that you've highlighted have also worked to, because they're outside of the formal process for whatever reason, better rectify the conditions in their workplace. What were some of the main examples that you'd like our audience to know about?
Yeah, so these groups, they're the umbrella term is alt labor, but it includes groups that are commonly known as worker centers. Again, nonprofit groups that are community-based organizations. The alt labor term also includes like regional alliances of worker centers and other sort of community-based groups. Also, national alliances like the National Domestic Workers Alliance. So these types of groups, they started out primarily trying to help their workers by, helping them file complaints when their employer steals their wages or discriminates against them, connect them to legal clinics and other legal services so they can exercise their private right of action to sue their exploitative employer. And perhaps they're most well known for what some of the groups call workplace justice campaigns or direct action, where they protest right out in front of the exploitative employer's workplace, bring public pressure to bear right on having an abusive manager fired, that sort of thing. And those sorts of campaigns are ongoing, and they're arguably one of the it's sort of like the bread and butter of what alt labor groups do. But over the last 20 years or so, a lot of these groups have realized that there's only so much they can do when they are sort of trying to rectify wrongs that have already been committed. And they're like always behind the ball, right? Always trying to catch up. And sort of some call these workplace justice campaigns and complaints and lawsuits Band-Aids, right? Because it's not treating the cause of the problem, right? It's addressing the symptoms of the problem, which is fundamentally, this power asymmetry in the workplace and exploitative behavior by the employers. And so what they've done increasingly over the last 2 decades or so is turn to public policy, right? And go to sometimes federal, but mostly state and local government bodies, and including like executives, mayors, that sort of thing, but in particular legislation, to try to pass new policies that will, protect them against wage theft and give them some rights and protections that they can take advantage of through the legal system. It's sort of like when you're vastly outmatched in terms of power, right, against these employers, right, who can fire you at will in the United States, can close up shop if they're investigated by the government and start up, a new business under a different name. How do you try to level the playing field, right? And so what these sort of poor, marginalized workers figured out is that they can appeal to the state, right, to the government, and try to use public policy and law to give them at least some tools, right, to fight back and to contest their exploitation. But if you don't mind me going on,
keep going.
They have also found, and they've been very successful in the policymaking arena, right? They've helped to increase the minimum wage in a lot of jurisdictions, passed anti-wage theft ordinances, health and safety, anti-discrimination policies. They've been very successful, kind of remarkably successful, which I talk about in my book. But they've found that in many jurisdictions, what we commonly call red states, right, even purple states and cities and counties, they are at a significant disadvantage in the policymaking process, right? They are also, relative to their opponents, employer associations and big business, they're really poor, really small. They're not mobile. Most of these groups are, community-based. And so it's really hard to get the policies they want. And when they do, the policies are often watered down, right, through the legislative process. So they've increasingly turned to more political engagement, right, trying to change the contours of the political system in which they operate so that they have a more, an environment that's more conducive to the kind of policymaking that they're looking for. So happy to talk to you more about that. But that's the basic trend that I've observed, and I try to document in this book, is going from sort of complaints and lawsuits and workplace justice campaigns to public policy to politics, including electoral politics.
And the shift in policy over the past few decades has kind of put these groups in that position, right? Where we have systematically weakened labor protections over a process of decades. This latest upsurge gives hope for the future in terms of just the kind of public sentiment around organizing and the wins that groups like the UAW and others have stacked up. But you talk about how it's a drift from labor law to employment law that kind of forces some of these groups to form and fill the vacuum that was left by labor law. Can you explain that process to our audience of how we got to that point from a statutory perspective?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So, in the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Dealers passed the National Labor Relations Act, which they envisioned as, the great solution to the labor problem in America, right? This would be the way that, we could have fewer strikes, fewer disruptions of commerce, and also give, workers a statutory right to bargain collectively, form unions and bargain collectively. And they thought that it would spread. I don't know how far exactly they hoped it would spread, but we now know, looking back, that it only got to about a third of the private sector in the 1950s. And then it started a sort of precipitous decline, right, in the 60s. And so in terms of the number of workers who have taken advantage of their collective bargaining rights to join unions. And so collective bargaining is the best, right? It's kind of the gold standard because it allows workers acting together to set, in a negotiation with their employers, the terms and conditions of their own employment. And so that can be tailored specifically to different firms and companies and different industries. And, it's like taking a scalpel, right, rather than something more blunt to the issue of workers' rights. But as fewer and fewer workers have found themselves able to take advantage of their collective bargaining rights, and this is a whole story about employer mobilization against unions, but also, anti-union forces in politics who have prevented pro-labor reform legislation from passing. So, this happened most recently during the first 2 years of the Biden administration with the PRO Act, right, which the filibuster basically killed. The anticipation of the filibuster made it impossible for advocates to keep pushing. So what ends up happening is that labor law is stuck in sort of a 1930s industrial world. It's what legal scholar Cynthia Esland has called it's ossified, right? The ossification of labor law over the last 70 or 80 years. And so, unions, starting in the 60s in particular, began pushing for employment laws, right? Which are, anti-discrimination statutes, protections for whistleblowers, everything that we now think of under the umbrella of paid time off, paid leave, family medical leave, higher minimum wages, laws setting the sort of like the basic minimums of terms and conditions of work, right? And this allows workers two pathways of redress, right? You can complain to state agencies and the National Department of Labor, or you can file a lawsuit, right? The problem is, for a lot of low-wage workers who don't have the resources to hire a lawyer, right, or don't have, really strong English skills and have difficulty navigating the bureaucracy, these are really not effective protections, right, against exploitation of the type we're talking about here. So employment laws have proliferated, and they're something, they're good, right, but they're not enough. Unfortunately, though, short of reforming national labor law, it's sort of all workers have to look to. So, but I think it's worth pointing out that these employment laws that the alt labor groups and unions have been pushing for decades now, they do chip away. I think of it as sort of chipping away at the power imbalance in the workplace. So consider like paid time off or advanced scheduling, right? Fair work week policies like we have here in Chicago. This is something where the employer has always had sort of carte blanche to schedule you for whenever they want, right? And you often don't get advance notice of what your schedule is going to be. Well, now workers in jurisdictions that have these policies have some modicum of control over their own schedule, their own lives. If they need to take time off to care for a family member who's ill, right? Or if they have to go to court to on a case of domestic abuse, they can do that, right? So it takes just a little bit of that power away from the employer, right? They legally are not able to prohibit you from exercising those rights. So it's sort of like baby steps, right, to giving workers a bit more power and leverage over their own working lives.
And some of the most common, I think, abuses that or maybe the most common, you can let me know, abuses that you do talk about is wage theft. Can you speak about the problem of wage theft and particularly how it targets non-union labor and how honestly ubiquitous it is? I think it's the number one in terms of dollar figures, theft, right? If I'm not even saying it right, but number one in terms of dollar figures, in terms of how much money is stolen from somebody basically in this country. It's so common that and goes so undetected all the time, in part because we have such weak labor protections. How does wage theft fit into this dynamic?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. It's a huge problem. And in fact, studying wage theft is what got me into this line of research in the first place. And I still do quantitative studies of wage theft. There have been some studies that have argued that it costs Americans more per year than retail theft and other types of theft combined, right? It's a huge cost. It's billions and billions of dollars that workers are not getting paid. It's sort of the extraction of wealth, right, from the business class and employers of workers who can least afford it. And what I study in particular is minimum wage violations because it's somewhat easier to study just because of the types of surveys I work with, but also it's kind of the most pernicious form of wage theft. It's when someone is entitled to earning the minimum wage, and that covers almost all low-wage workers. If they don't earn the minimum wage, and we find that about 20% of their income is usually lost. Among those who suffer a minimum wage violation, they lose about 20% of their income. That's a huge amount of money for people who are trying to live on really poverty wages to begin with. And so wage theft is one of, if not the biggest reasons why low-wage workers turn to worker centers and other alt-labor groups is because they've suffered wage theft. They know it's wrong. If you're entitled to a certain wage, which is poverty wage anyway, you know that there must be something wrong. Even if you don't know the intricacies of labor law and employment law, you know when your employer's not paying you. So that often brings folks in, and then the groups employ a variety of strategies, all the way from just asking the employer to can you actually pay this person? We noticed that they have received, they have a record and they have pay stubs or even just a journal of their hours, and you haven't paid them. Can you pay them back? Sometimes employers say, oh, sorry, I messed up. Here are your wages, but oftentimes they don't, and so the worker centers have to escalate. But the turn to public policy has been useful in a lot of cities. Like more and more cities now have their own offices of labor standards enforcement.
To interject, I mean, New York City's minimum wage is different than other parts of the state, for example, right? That you see that in other areas where a standard of living is higher. They've been able to raise the minimum wage on some of these companies.
Yeah, exactly. And the first city to raise the minimum wage above the state level was San Francisco back in 2003, right, over 20 years ago. But what they found was that neither the Federal Department of Labor nor the California Labor Commissioner's Office was empowered to enforce that higher minimum wage. So they had to create an office, right? And so they created the first municipal office of labor standards enforcement in San Francisco, and have been beefing it up ever since, right? These agencies are usually really underfunded, and they don't have as many staff as they should. And so the effort now is to sort of, really empower these agencies to go out and investigate really problematic industries, like food and beverage places, private households, which is a really tricky one, but super important. Personal and laundry services like nail salons, meatpacking plants. Agriculture, as you mentioned, is a big problem in a lot of places. And so it's a huge problem. It's one of the primary focuses of these groups, and
tipped work, I would imagine, is also a big part. When you mention nail salons and things like that, that seems like a situation where that's rife for that kind of exploitation that you describe.
Oh, it is 100%. I mean, the law says that if you are a tipped worker, you're entitled to $2.13 an hour. This is the federal minimum wage for tipped workers, and then your tips have to bring you up to $7.25, right? The current federal minimum wage. And if they don't, the employer has to make up the difference. Well, that is sufficiently complicated enough, right? And it happens in the shadows, right? Enough that it often doesn't happen, right? But I will say, even in places that have abolished the sub-minimum wage, which is great, the One Fair Wage campaign has done an incredible job of eliminating that in a lot of places, but it's an ongoing campaign. We still see the highest rates, some of the highest rates of minimum wage violations in the food and beverage industry, right? So it's still just an industry where people are regularly exploited, and continues to be a big problem.
Just a tip for people, no pun intended here. This sticks out in my mind. I remember getting my nails done one time, and there was a male owner of the business, and all the women there were working. And he kept insisting I give the tip in the envelope to him, as opposed to as directly to the woman who had done my nails. And I remember thinking, no. And he was pissed because I walked back to point being, pro tip, give your tip directly to the person that's servicing you, because that was the energy that I got. But that's obviously just a personal anecdote. Daniel Galvin, the book is called Alt Labor and the New Politics of Workers' Rights. We will put a link to that book in the description wherever people are listening to or watching this. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.